Well, I spoke to Lynn Loo, CEO of the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonisation, and she tells us more about biofuels and why they are crucial to decarbonising the maritime industry.
For a biofuel to be truly sustainable, your feedstock needs to be truly sustainable. So you, for example, don't want to use feedstocks that compete with agriculture and for food, but you can use things like corn stalks. So the stalks, the dry part of the vegetation that's not for food consumption, that would be okay for sustainable biofuels, or waste, and it includes animal waste, et cetera, as well, or waste fat and cooking oil as well that one can use. And those would, if you make biofuels from those would count as sustainable biofuels. They're important because they have reduced carbon content, right? Because you're reusing them. And by using those instead of fossil fuel, you could reduce carbon emissions from marine fuel.
In February, you completed trials on 2 supply chains of biofuel blends for vessel bunkering. What were the key lessons learned from that, and how is this moving forward?
Yeah, so I mean, in scoping that pilot, we spoke with 150 stakeholders to try and understand what the pain points are and what the barriers to adopting biofuels are. And repeatedly we heard, number one is the price point, and then number two, it's basically transparency across that supply chain. So when you source biofuels from the producer, and as the biofuel comes down the supply chain, there are many points of intervention and contamination. And so the pilot basically allows us to trace that biofuels, where it comes from, trace how much is there and the quality of the biofuels all along the supply chain until it gets bunkered on the ship and it's combusted, so that we have assurance on the quality, on the quantity, and therefore the abatement of the emissions on that biofuels. This allows the users to have confidence that they are getting what they paid for, since biofuels command a green premium.
I suppose, Lynn, that the ideal situation is to get all industry stakeholders on board. But for those that are still reluctant, what will get more of them to transition to biofuels based on the current energy mix?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not to get all stakeholders on board because there isn't enough biofuels. But the idea is biofuels is something that is lower in carbon emissions that you can use today, right? So that's why I think when we're talking about decarbonization, we need to quickly bend the curve. And so this is something one can do today. Having this framework, for example, to provide confidence and transparency around using biofuels is really important. That said, I think the ecosystem is coming together very quickly. So in Singapore, for example, last year, 70,000 tons of biofuels was bunkered here in Singapore. And increasingly, right, Singapore's working on putting together provisional national standards to specify what marine biofuels should be. And in fact, one of our directors at the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonisation is part of this working group that helped put together these standards. So these are the kinds of things we can do to move the ecosystem along to help adopt biofuels.
And Lynn, like you mentioned, biofuel bunkering is gaining traction in Singapore. So how do you hope to see the trend evolving here? And is this also the case elsewhere?
Yes, I think it's increasingly being used. And again, I mean, I think the scale question aside, because biofuels come, the availability is a challenge, but scale aside, I think it's being increasingly adopted, and that's a good thing because we want to decarbonize and we want to start now, and this is one of the things we can do to start now. Biofuels are blended with fossil fuels to lower carbon emissions, and this is something you can do with existing ships, existing engines, and so it's a solution that's available today.
And Lynn, while LNG and biofuels look to be the main focus in the short term, the development of other marine fuels is also continuing. For example, there's methanol, there's ammonia. Where does development currently stand on moving these along, as well as their related safety and environmental concerns?
Yeah, okay, so methanol exists today. So again, I think there are different colors of methanol, and the different colors refer to how these fuels are made. So one would want to use e-methanol or green methanol because they have lower carbon emissions. So methanol supply chain exists today and methanol infrastructure exists today. And if you look at the order book for vessels, you see increasingly number of orders for vessels that are dual fuel that can burn methanol as well. So I think that's progressing and it's moving along. We are working on ammonia because ammonia as a potential new fuel, the supply chain doesn't exist, the infrastructure doesn't exist. It's a new fuel. In fact, engines that burn ammonia don't exist today. Ships that use ammonia don't exist today. So there are lots of technical and operational gaps. And so GCMD is trying to fill some of these technical and operational gaps. That said, I think the ecosystem is quickly coming together as well. We've moved from an era of declaring ambition to taking action. So in this case, we are unveiling in 2 days our ammonia safety study for conducting a bunkering pilot in Singapore. This study basically said that ammonia can be bunkered or transferred between vessels in a pilot configuration with no showstoppers involved. And so there are risks, but these risks can be mitigated. So we're very excited about this study. The study complements other studies, including one that was conducted by the Global Maritime Forum, the Getting to Zero Coalition. This is called the Nordic Green Ammonia Powered Ships study, where they looked at ship configuration and what it takes to be able to burn ammonia on ships. So it's piecing these different kinds of pilots and studies together that, again, we can move the ecosystem along towards being able to use ammonia as a fuel. So we're still a ways away with ammonia, but the different pieces are moving. And so that's what's encouraging.